Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Top Voice Tuesday on Tuesday, February 25th. It's a wonderful opportunity to have Christopher Lind here, another top voice. I'm going to give him a chance to introduce himself in some colorful ways we were just talking about before we went live. Um, for those of you that have been watching this, please note that I do post all the episodes on my YouTube channel, Michael J. Lopez 9, and so you can go back. We had a great conversation with Tim Teen last week, and I think we're on 8 or 9 episodes this week. So just really enjoying doing this with everyone, and we're into February already. So for those of you that are also joining in, please do put in the chat where you're from. We'll take a question or two as we usually do. I've gotten some great questions the last few weeks. So Chris, please let us know a little bit. We're going to talk about how to
Yeah,
find your gaps. And it was just when we met a great statement that stuck with me. But before we jump into that, tell us who you are, where you are, what you do, and we're
sure.
going to jump into it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to it. I know we connected through the whole Top Voice program, and when we chatted, I knew that we'd have a great conversation. So, for folks who don't know who I am, I'm Christopher Lind. I've spent my whole career at what I say is the intersection of business, technology, and human experience. So, really, at this weird, quirky, I was a total computer geek who found human performance and behavior more interesting, and then have been mixing and matching that ever since. And so I jumped out of the corporate sphere at the end of last year to focus specifically on that, just because of how many people were struggling to figure out how do we use technology better, especially with the boom in AI. And it's a tough question, and many people are wrestling through it. And the implications of that decision are serious. You can make some really big mistakes, and so my goal is to help people not make those mistakes. But outside of that, I'm a dad of 8 kids. I love my wife. I'm a devoted husband. And then I think we were talking about this backstage, very existential backstage. But I grew up in a funeral home, and so it's not uncommon for people to have a conversation with me, and I'll be talking about mortality, which is usually a very like, whoa, why are we talking about this? And to me, that's very, it's like, well, because it's inevitable. And like, don't you think about it regularly? It affects the way
Yeah.
you live your life. So
Yeah. No, it's great. We both have young kids, young babies. Mine's 9.5 months old, and she's a Spitfire. So um, she's really the best.
that's awesome.
Chris, tell us a little bit about what you did in the corporate world and how you made this specific transition into kind of this entrepreneurial life and what you do, and then we'll jump into a couple other questions.
Sure. So I swore I would never be an entrepreneur. I'm like, I don't want to do my own thing. I grew up around small business ownership and was like, no, not for me, type of a thing. So I really didn't think I would. But in terms of the corporate side, I really struggled with figuring out where I fit. I always felt like a duck out of water
Mhm.
because it's like I was really good at technology. I knew how to use it, but I also worked with people and was fascinated by how people affect business. And that's how, if you looked at my LinkedIn, you'd go, you've been a corporate training guy, right? Like you just went all the way up to the C-suite with it. And it was like, yeah, on paper, it looks like that, but that really wasn't ever it. I was always the person that business leaders kind of called in and
Right.
said, where do we go? And how do we use technology to get these people along? Because people are the X factor.
Right.
I mean, you can optimize and Six Sigma your way through any process,
Right.
but then you throw people in the mix, and it's like, oh snap! Like,
Right.
I don't know where we go with this. And that's what I loved, because computers and process was predictable. People, not so much. So it was a
Not
fun
so much.
challenge. But then what happened was I had several years ago considered, I'd started changing my mind, going, I didn't want to just do this for one company. And it was, people were already asking, hey, can you come help with this or that? And I kind of started getting the itch for, I mean, maybe this could be a thing. I don't know. But when you have a family of 10, the days of my 20s where it's like, I'm just going to go off
Yeah.
and do my thing and see what happens, sleep on my friend's couch if I need to. I can't really do that. So I knew if that day would ever come, the stars would have to align, and it would really have to come together. And so at the end of last year, I'd been with the company I was at for about 4 years. Things were starting to move in a direction where it didn't make sense for me to continue moving forward. And so I said, okay, well then, that I guess is the path that makes sense. And my wife was the one who was like, do it. Cause I was going, well, do I just go get another job? Or like, I don't know what to do. She's like, it's time. So that's how it came. But we actually had a baby number 8 came 3 days after I got the news. And so it was like, I'm not really thinking about work right now.
Yeah.
And so I took some time. So really the beginning of the year this year is been the beginning of it.
Yeah. There's such a great story in there, or a great lesson, I think, for folks about when the stakes are high. I can relate to your journey in the sense that when I moved out of my last consulting company before starting my own, um, my wife, much like yours, said, this is the moment for you to go build the thing you've always wanted to go build. And what was great about it, I think I've told this story before. I was in the middle of an interview with another company, and I got asked a question. Guy's name happened to be Matt. I'd known him from my previous company, and I stopped and I said, "Hey, Matt, it's about halfway through. I'm going to stop you right here. I can't do this anymore. I can't do this for someone else. I have to do it for me." And what was great about that, and we'll talk about this in the gaps conversation, is it removed the if question, and it was just
Yeah.
about how, right? It's not
Yeah.
if I do this, it's how. And it's such a great moment of clarity. And I think a lot of people, when they pursue change and transformation, they second guess where they're headed. And you just really have to kind of go all in, and you can second guess the path, but
Yep.
not the destination and where you're heading. So that's great. So let's jump in and talk about this idea. But I'd love to hear your top voice journey. How did you get to the top of the top voice mountain? I ask everybody this question, and
Yeah.
really enjoy people's responses.
It was a very strange one for me, in that I've been active on LinkedIn for a long time, which content creation, I thought, again, it was one of those, I'm never going to do that because I'm actually really introverted. And so the thought of putting myself out there, being public, I was kind of a very private person and whatever. But earlier in my career, I had a mentor who was like, well, Christopher, you've got a lot of really good thoughts. You should be out there. But he very much had this perspective of, and that means you got to go to conferences, you got to go to networking events, or what, which I would rather have my fingernails torn off than go to that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so for me, I was like, yeah, that's cool, but that's not for me. And that's where I started to discover how to have a voice in a way that was more comfortable for me. And so that's where LinkedIn really played a big role because I could share my thoughts. I could engage with community. I could be part of something while not doing it the way everybody had always said, you got to do it this way. So
Mm.
it's been over a decade. I think I've played around with writing things. I do live streams. Kind of, you name it, I've played around with it.
Yeah.
I actually always thought it was cool. I'm like, that blue badge, like that's so cool. But it was a very elusive. I mean, even I know tons of people at LinkedIn. And if you're like, how do you get the blue badge? They're like, it's our well guarded. Like we can't, because when I got it, I didn't even realize what it was.
Yeah.
I thought it was another one of those yellow ones, and I was like, yeah, I know. It's just because I contribute to stuff. I didn't think anything of it, and then I actually logged into my account and I saw the blue, and I'm like, what?
Yeah.
And so I actually emailed my friends at LinkedIn. I was like, wow, thanks. Like you guys must have done so. Like, thanks for, and they're like, oh no, that was not us.
Yeah.
We don't even know how they did. And so
How
really
that
it was very
happens.
much by accident. And I was like, what a cool recognition.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people that I asked that question to, myself included, and thank you for the comment. Uh, it's great to see people online. For those that are online, please let us know where you're coming from, and drop a couple questions in here. We're about to dive in. Um, this The one thing I've seen consistently about the top voice journey is that most people didn't try to stand out with some goal of getting recognized. It was about having something to say. It was about experimenting with the platform. It was about sharing messages. It was about consistency, about repetition.
Yeah.
And there's such a beautiful metaphor in there about loving the journey of engaging as opposed to thinking, oh, I'm going to go get this recognition. You know,
That's where whenever you see like the articles, like here's the 10 steps to be a
yeah,
top, I'm always like, if that's your approach, you're already missing it
yeah,
because you have to do it because I just love doing this,
yeah,
not because I want a badge, which
right.
will actually tie to our conversation today.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about this idea. And again, just to remind everyone, when Chris and I met, we met through the program. We jumped on a call. We're chatting, sharing our stories. And I asked Christopher, what do you do? And your response was, I help people find their gaps. And that
Yep.
just stuck with me. I do something similar, but I never describe it in that way. So what does that mean? Chris,
Yeah.
tell us what that means and give us some examples.
So in this, and much of it was inspired by my growing up in a funeral home, because I watched on repeat countless people pursue things they thought were a goal that actually was just activity. And
Mm,
so they would go through life doing lots of stuff, but they didn't really know why, or they hadn't really thought deeply about, well, what am I actually trying to do here? Or what's on the other side? So that's where like the top voice badge.
yeah,
If somebody said, I really want to get top voice, I'd be like, why?
right.
Like what about it? That's an object. That's a thing you chase. I remember I was coaching somebody and they were like, I want to make $1 million. And I was like, for what?
Right.
For what purpose? And to them, the gap was, I want to make $1 million. I'm like, but that's not a gap. The gap is, what do you think is missing that million, that the $1 million is what you have in your head as the bridge. And that's not at, you're going to get it. And then you're going to go, well, I don't like, I'm at the end of the bridge now. I have no idea where this goes or
Yeah.
whatever. And unfortunately, I see that way too often. So when I say I help people find their gaps, I wrote a book that I just never published because that's kind of the thing. I'm like, I did a thing and it made sense for the moment. And then the rest of it didn't make sense.
Well, somebody
But
who
it was,
just wrote a book, you should absolutely put it out there because it's a very
it's
good.
been sitting on my desktop for 2 years. It's all done with the early praise and everything. Um, but it was this idea of, yeah, but do you really know what you're pursuing and why? And life's too short. That's my thing. Like life's too short. And it's not just a personal thing. I see this with companies. Companies just relentlessly pursuing stuff. And it's like, to what end? I mean, you're gonna have a bigger quarter earnings next quarter. There's just gonna be another quarter after that.
Yeah.
And then after that, and after that. And like, okay, well, where
There,
does this all go? What's
there's
the
this.
legacy you want to leave?
Yeah. And it's so interesting because I love what you just said. And I'll share maybe an example. But one of the questions I get a lot is, Michael, how did you get this job? Right. And it's sort of the same question to you, right? Like, how did this become a thing that you do for people and you make money doing it, which is novel and fun and like you're not really thinking of it as work, but you've identified a need in humans. And I think one of those needs, it's so interesting, is we imagine a version of ourselves at the other end of these goals that we're chasing. And we
Yeah.
believe for a lot of reasons, and you know, there's good reasons in there. We believe for a lot of reasons that there's a version of us that's happier, more fulfilled, more content, more successful, whatever the thing that you've attributed to that goal. To your point, that $1 million serves a purpose. What is that
Yeah.
purpose? What is it allowing you to do that you can't do now? And what I think is so interesting about what you do, and to some degree what I do, is that as people go along that journey, I don't know that they're asking themselves the question of why are you on this journey?
Yeah.
So what are some of
It's
the
easy to
things,
miss.
yeah, what are some of the things that you've seen people realize or shift or adjust
Yeah.
as you help
So
them
we'll
through this
we'll
process?
stick with that story
Right.
because this gentleman wanted to make $1 million, and he, Christopher, how do I do this? Here's my business plan. Here's where we're going. Here's all these, help me, shape my metrics and whatever. And I just kind of pushed aside. I'm like, let's talk about why. Like, what are you trying to get? And it really was, he was a little offended at first. I
Yeah.
didn't talk to you to question why I'm pursuing a million. I talked to you to get me $1 million. And I remember going, I'm not saying I'm not going to get you there. I'm just saying it's really important because the activities we work on, you don't want to waste that. It's precious time.
Right.
So we took some time, and everybody thinks that getting to gaps is like some long, oh, it's got to be 6, 9, you dig in for years. And it's like, no, we just sat and talked about what were you really hoping to get into? And we had a very honest, vulnerable conversation. And at the core of it, he desperately wanted to be there for his family. That's what he wanted. And as we dug into it, I'm like, they're there now.
Right.
And you're missing it because you're chasing this goal that you think is going to get you somewhere that's going to then let you do it. And in the process, you're completely missing out on the very thing you say you want. And it was almost like this light bulb moment where it was like, holy crap.
Yeah.
And I'm like, look, we'll work on, financial success.
Strategy.
I'm not saying
Yeah.
we won't do it, but let's be really careful that you don't miss the actual goal you're striving for right then. And I'm like, they're sitting outside your office right now,
Right.
and you're working nights and weekends and doing all this stuff in the hopes of having enough money to take them on a vacation. I have a sneaking suspicion your kids just would love it if you spent the evenings talking with them. And it was very much a, whoa, like we still went where he wanted to go, but in a very, very, very different way
Yeah.
than he originally had in his head.
My guess is that's a powerful example. My guess is that people don't come to you because they know they have a gap. My guess is that people come to you because they have a different objective, and in the process, they find is there a method
Yeah.
that you use? Is it coaching? Is it just questions? Is there a process? How does this
So
happen?
yeah, as I was figuring out what I was going to do for myself, like as my own thing, that very much became, because I have a system that I use that I'm like, okay, there's a way I do it. There's a system of questions. There's a group of people I talk to. There's a way I map this out. And I'm like, that's actually probably what my go-to should be as a solo, as a small business owner is. And the other thing was people were consistently coming to me going, how do we work together, Christopher? Like, what do we do? And I'm like, well, that's a big question because there's probably a lot of things we could do, but just like going back to, I want to work on the right things. I don't want to waste your time. I don't want to waste your money. I don't want to tell you, do a thing. And that's why I have this pulse analysis, because it very much is in 6 weeks or less. Like, let me come in and gather perspective. Let me ask the right questions, talk to the right people, look at the right data sources, and then let me come back to you with here's my honest take on where you are right now, all the other things you're doing, and where I think are the best places you can go and the best steps you can take. And sometimes it's nothing like what they think. I hear, Christopher, I thought I was going to call you and we were going to have this consulting project on this. I had someone recently that they brought me in thinking we're going to have you help guide this $3 million AI project. And I did this. I'm like, I actually don't think you should do that project at all.
Right.
I think you need to do this instead. And that's it. And that's it. There's nothing else to it. So sometimes it's a lot easier than people realize.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. It calls to mind a story for me. I have a client that I started with last year. They came to me with a process question. Very
Okay.
small project. We have a process problem. We're not getting product out the door the way we should be. We're having some internal inefficiencies. Things are slow. We're having some tension. 17, 18 interviews later, I came back and said, you don't have a process problem. You have a people problem, and you have a
Yep.
culture problem. And you have a set of unstated behaviors that are kind of holding this organization back, which is a different way of asking the question than I think you ask. And the way I ask it is, I ask people what's holding them back. And what's interesting about that question, and I'm curious about your perspective on that, is
Yeah.
it forces you to think about that version of yourself in the future, but it grounds you in a present conversation about, man, what's the thing that's keeping me from getting there? And that's usually the gap. That's
Yeah.
usually the thing that's sort of stopping you from making progress.
Yeah.
I think it's so interesting because I love your perspective on this as kind of a solopreneur in this new life. What I believe about your approach is it's not what you do, but it's how you do it.
It
Most
is.
people might call you, "Oh, I'm a coach, I'm a consultant." I get that a lot. "Oh, you do coaching." And there's you could throw a rock and hit a coach.
I know,
They're
like
everywhere.
whatever that means.
Yeah. So how do you help clients understand your method and process? Because that's what's unique about the way you show up for people. I had the same
Yeah,
problem. People are like, "Oh, you do change management?" And I'm like, "Well, I mean, kind of.
kind
I
of.
guess if that's the easiest way to think about what I do,
Yeah.
but how I do it is very different."
So I think this is something that was really important to me, especially as we moved into the AI age, is we vastly underestimate the power of human relationships.
Mm,
And so for me, yes, it's about the process. Yes, it's about the performance, but it's also about the person. And if anything, that's almost more important, is to actually understand the individual and what makes them tick and what are they really going for? Because you can get people on the right path, you can get them to the right place, and you can make them completely miserable doing it. And maybe they achieve the goal, maybe they close the gap, but if they're 1,000 times more miserable than they were when they started, to me, that's failure. And I
mm,
think that's one of the things where and that's why I got into the field I did instead of going into building a software company, was there's a lot of people who really are struggling, or they're running on a treadmill, or they're doing this and that, and they haven't really thought about why. And they're truly completely miserable. And they can't quite put their finger on why.
yeah.
And that's where I've always really enjoyed getting to know the person. And to me, that's the key. And that's why
Yeah.
it's like, well, what's your 10-step process, Christopher? It's like, I, I think I just want to get to know you, which
Right.
can sometimes be very jarring for people, where it's like, whoa, me, like, we're not here to talk about me.
Yeah.
Actually, yes, we are.
Actually, we are right. There's a I have a question, but maybe leading up to that, I think is an insight, which is this idea that we are all there's a formula that I think a lot of people, particularly in the career arc, subscribe to, right? You go to college, you come out, you get a job, you go through and you become an individual contributor up to some sort of a team lead, maybe a manager, up to a director, vice president, and there's a ladder and you get promoted and you go through that, and there's a
Yep.
structure to this arc that we follow, and some of that is phases of life, stages of maturity, stages of
Sure.
growth. You have a family relationship, you get a dog, you have kids, whatever that pathway is. And part of what I hear you talking about, and this is certainly reflective of my own journey, was why are you following that path? Because you think you're supposed to, or because that path is actually the one that you enjoy? And
Yeah.
there's a really interesting, for those folks listening, and would love to get a question or two for Christopher as we go. There's a guy named Dr. James Hollis who has done some seminal work on this conversation about the second half of life and what we transition to in this conversation. That for the first half of life, in a general sense, we tend to be operating under the concept of what we think the world wants from us. What
Yeah.
what what are we here to accomplish for, based on our kind of success ladder? And somewhere in the middle of life, and that happens for different people depending on your age and experience, you start asking yourself a different question, which is, what am I here to do for the world? Not what does the world want for me, but what are the gifts I have to offer and what can I do to make the world a better place? And that's a different
Very
conversation that
different
I think
framework.
is tied to this
Yeah.
conversation of gaps. So my question for you, for the folks listening or watching this back later, is can I find my own gaps? Do I need someone to help me, or can I go on a journey myself?
So it's nothing can be done in isolation. I think where I always have guardrails around that is there can be this idea, and I've seen way too many, really bad marketing programs that say, like, you have to do that, which again just goes against the very thing. You have to have a coach. You have to do this. You have to go there. And it's like, yeah, be careful. Is it a journey you can go on your own? No. Does it mean you have to follow someone else's framework for what
Yeah.
that looks like? No, it doesn't. And, so if somebody tells you got to have X number of friends in your life, you got to have this many, take it with a grain of salt,
Yeah.
because your journey is your own. And the only person who really understands it and the one who has to walk it is you. And so that's where I say, can you do it alone? No. Do you necessarily have to, call Christopher Lind or call Michael Lowe? You have to do that. Like, no. Can it be really helpful? Sure.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things where a good mentor of mine, as I was getting started with things, asked me as I was putting together this path analysis. They said, Christopher, would you buy this? If you were back in your C-suite position, would you buy this?
Yeah.
And I said, yes. Even though I was confident in my strategy, I was super active in my networks, I knew my business stakeholders, everything. Would I said, I'd pay to have it done 4 times a year.
Yeah.
4 times. Like I totally would. To me, it would be a rounding error to say, you know what? Yes, I trust this. And so, yes, even if what comes back is you're on the right track, here's something you might want to consider. Like, yeah, of course I
Yeah.
would.
I,
And I think sometimes that's what we're afraid of, is like, we're afraid somebody might tell us our path isn't quite right, or we're afraid of what we might come out. Like, fear drives us into really weird places. And again, that's something growing up in a funeral home I saw all the time. People do so many stupid things because they're terrified of the fact they're going to die.
yeah.
And getting around that and going, that's a reality. So what are you going to do about it?
That it's a sobering question, and I think you hear this in all of the wisdom that's available from authors and philosophers, right? Which is this idea that people rarely regret the things they do in life. They regret the things they didn't do and the versions of themselves that they didn't take a chance on. I mean, look, I was scared for years to leave big consulting and start my own thing, right? I was seeking the safety of a regular paycheck and annual bonus, but I wanted to be provocative and edgy and, forward leaning in my thought process. The problem was for me, what was happening was I was creating a brand as a bit of a, I'm a little bit of a troublemaker. So I would hurt myself in these big companies because I wasn't following their system.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
so the gap for me, if I put it in my own terms, was the gap for me was the fear of truly standing on my own in a way to build the thing I wanted to build. Right. And that's
Yeah.
just such a great reminder. And this idea that you can't do it on your own, I think is really important. And a couple cautionary tales for folks listening. And if there's a question you want to shoot, fire it away. I've got a bunch of them, so no worries either way. Is not doing it alone doesn't mean if someone's selling you the proven 5-step follow my coaching playbook or my automatic
Run.
formula, and that should make you nervous. It should make
Yes.
you cautious that there is no easy button in these conversations. And that's the point, right? The point is I say this to my clients, the growth is in the struggle. And
Yeah.
the struggle for you is what you do is challenge people to look inward and really ask themselves the hard questions. And I just love that you're doing that. I love that this is a job that I think is so needed, right? It's not a strategy job. It's not a process job. It's not a operations job. It's a job about people. And I
Yeah.
just think that, you're doing the world a wonderful service. Before I ask the last question,
Sure.
which is always my bonus question, I guess one thing I'd share to add for folks on the call is I think we're learning that the power of great questions is what you need to start with as you start to look at why you're heading down certain paths. And I've always said there's 3 questions, it's in the book that I wrote, that can change your life. The first question is, how have I done something in the past? Why am I on this path? What am I doing? What am I working towards? Why do I want that $1,000,000? The second question is how did my pursuit of that serve me? And like the example you gave, right? Hey, you're chasing $1,000,000, and what's happening is you're missing the moments that are here in front of
The
you.
thing you think you want.
Right, right. And then the third question is, how might I do it differently? Right. And what I think you
Yep.
probably said to this individual was, what if you stopped chasing $1,000,000 and said, what if I have enough to take care of my family and enjoy them every day? What would that look like, right? And
Yep.
these questions are so important. And what I tell people that I serve in the same way is, if you're going to ask yourself a hard question, you really got to want the answer, because the answer is
Yes.
not always what you think it's going to be.
It's
And I
probably
think,
one of the biggest dangers of AI is it'll give you what you want.
right.
And often what you want is a very pretty road to tragedy.
Ooh, that's powerful. That's powerful. So we have our bonus question,
Okay.
Christopher, that was left for you. Every week we do this, and so it's a great tie-in. So as a leader, as a business leader, as someone who's been in corporate America and now in this coaching service oriented world, how do you define success, and how do you contribute to your own success? What does that mean? What is that metric for you, and how do you pursue it?
Yeah. So for anybody who follows me, faith is a big part of my life. And so for me, I really look at, am I doing everything I can to serve God and serve other people? And even, that aside, people might not even share my worldview. That's not my goal, is to try and get people to share it. But I also grew up with a grandfather who always said, leave the campground better than when you left it.
Mm,
And that can be such a counterintuitive way to go, because it's always like, well, what about me? I got to get me.
right.
And we have this tendency to go, well, I don't want them to have it easier than I did. Like I had to go through it. They should too.
Yeah.
And for me, I look at success of, can I look back and go, that it's better. It's an easier path for the people behind me to walk. And did I lift the people around me up? And did people go on to do better things than I did? If they did, then I'm succeeding. If I look back and people are having a harder time and nobody's quite ever achieving the success I had, then I actually consider that failure, even if statistically, metrically, like whatever, it all looks good on paper.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. And there's a, leave the room better than you found it. Leave the campground better than you found it. Doesn't mean we don't give people behind us the chance to struggle, because struggle is where growth
Sure.
happens. But you don't deny people the opportunity for growth. You can give people the opportunity to struggle and serve them at the same time. And I think that's a beautiful
Yeah.
message and a good one to leave
Well,
on.
because going back to people, you can't change anyone else. You can't.
I say it all the
All
time.
you can do is set it up and give them the environment to be able to change. At
Yeah.
some point, they've got to take that. And that's where, to your point, it's not about trying to create a campground to make sure everybody's successful. People are still going to fail no matter how good you do.
Yeah.
That's not on you. But did you do everything? And that's one of the questions I ask all the time. Can you say you did everything you could have? The answer to
And
that's no. Those are the regrets you have on your deathbed. Is
absolutely.
going, I know I could have done more. I know I could have done this, and I just didn't.
Yeah.
Why? I just
Just,
didn't.
I just didn't. Yeah. Well, what a dose of inspiration. Thank you, Christopher, for the time. Is there anything you want to leave people with, to reach out to you, where to find you, to connect with you?
Sure. I mean, I'm very active on LinkedIn. I have a website now, christopherlin.co. And that actually goes, because I'm active on Substack and YouTube and all this. And then you can find out what I do all through that. So that's kind of my primary pane of glass if people want to find more about me. I mean, in terms of final thoughts, I think the biggest thing is, like, if somebody's watching or listening to this and feeling overwhelmed or scared, or it's like you hear this and you're like, this all sounds good, but like, I just am freaking out. So is everybody right now.
Yeah.
Like, I don't talk to a single person who's like, yeah, everything's, even the ones who are acting like they've got it all together, they don't. And I think having more of those conversations and being like, okay, we're all really struggling, right? Kind of like death. It's a reality.
Right.
So what are we going to do about that? And how can we help one another get through it? And yeah, I think sometimes people just need to know that you're not alone in whatever it is you're walking.
I appreciate that. Please reach out to Christopher if you are so inspired, or myself watching this back. Thanks for everyone for being a part of this today. If you want to watch old episodes, Michael J. Lopez 9 on YouTube, and we've got another one coming next week. every week in the month or in the year of 2025, we're going to do this. So thanks for being a part of the journey, Christopher. Thank you for what you do. And we'll see you all next time.